Good evening, and welcome to the Kuhn Academy for this installment of AP U.S. History, where we're not just learning history, we're making history. Okay, so we're going to talk to you today a little bit about the causes of the American Revolution. Hopefully we understand already that the American Revolution begins as early as 1763. Now, at the time, they don't know they're going through a revolution, but historians sort of see this as the beginning of the change in the colonies. All right. Now, with the French-Indian War that we left off with today, that is going to leave the country of England about 140 million pounds in debt due to the war. That number doesn't mean a whole lot, but it was 20 million pounds before the war. So a debt multiplies by 7, that's going to create a stress on a country. All right. Most of you know our debt today is around $19 trillion, and it's a couple 100,000 more than when I just told you a few seconds ago. It continues to rise. So if that multiplied times 7, you can imagine how crazy our economy would get. All right. So the British government realized that they had to make a change because they needed to protect these colonies and also ensure some of this new land that they had acquired here in pink from the French. All right, so they passed the Proclamation Line of 1763. Only significant because it's the first time the British government had passed meaningful regulatory reform on colonial behavior. That's really what's most significant about it. We've had the Navigation Acts, we had the Head Act. Those things weren't enforced and nobody really cared. But this was going to be a serious law that they were going to enforce, which basically said that there will be no settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains. That's this mountain region right here that Britain had controlled since the 1600s. And said none of these new settlers were going to be able to move there, even though we just fought a war to acquire this. Okay. Reason being is that's where the Indians were, and if the British went out and settled out past there could be conflict with those Indians, and the British would have to protect them. It's very similar to the Lion King for those of you of Disney interest, where the elephant graveyard, which would be this pink area here, King Mufasa says you can't go out to the elephant graveyard because it's dangerous. That's where the crazy hyenas are in Whoopi Goldberg. So he says no going to the elephant graveyard. Well, the colonists are kind of like Simba, and they want to explore it because the land belongs to them. They have a rightful place to go. And we all know what happens to Mufasa, and we'll see what happens to King George shortly thereafter. All right, next up is the Sugar Act. Also not a huge significance, but another attempt to regulate colonial behavior. All right, we're trying to prevent molasses smuggling, which was becoming very rampant in the colonies. So they decided we're going to reduce the tax. We're going to cut it from 6 pence a gallon to 3 pence. All right, who's going to get upset about a tax being lowered? Well, two things. Number one was we were going to much more stringently enforce the tax. So instead of the 6 pence nobody was paying, we're going to make it 3 pence and then really put some teeth into it. So if you violated that law, you would be tried in a vice admiralty court. All right, not a court of a jury, not a court with a judge, but one where there is an admiral in the Navy determining your guilt or innocence. Therefore, there is no trial by jury. Coincidence, our Sixth Amendment to the Constitution guarantees us a trial by jury and a lawyer. That was taken away here in the Sugar Act. All right. Now, who is going to be upset? Are you going to be upset with this if you're a shoemaker? No. Are you going to be upset with this if you're a newspaper editor? No. You're going to be upset if you're a sugar smuggler. Not a lot of people were sugar smugglers. All right. And in the first year, they generated 3,000 pounds of revenue, but it cost 7,000 pounds to enforce the law. Not the best law done if you're trying to eradicate 140 million pounds of debt. So the British were forced to pass the Stamp Act. This, if you're going to know any act from this revolutionary period, this is the most significant because it placed a tax on different things, including almanacs, wills, marriage licenses, legal documents, playing cards, dice, newspapers. These are things that were used a little more frequently, albeit a small tax, kind of hard to avoid. If you're going to die, you need a will. If you're getting married, you need a marriage license. Kind of interesting I put one before the other. I probably should have went marriage before will, but nonetheless. Playing cards, yeah, you don't buy them very often, but you were a gambler, you're going to play cards. All right. Newspapers, most people bought those once or twice a week. Okay. What's pretty significant about this is it actually upset lawyers, it upset gamblers. These aren't people you want to upset. They love to argue, they love to fight, and that's going to create a ruckus here in the colonies. But the bottom line of this is this was passed without the colonists' consent. All right, so as a result, all right, the battle cry rings out in protest of the Stamp Act of no taxation without representation. All right, we've heard that before. It's got a nice ring to it. The British would tell you that you had representation. All right, they would argue of what was called virtual representation. With virtual representation, the British Parliament said that when we make decisions, we are representing all of England. All right, we are making decisions of what's best for the country. Okay, you're probably familiar with what the colonists wanted, which is actual representation. In actual representation, you choose a leader, you elect someone, and then they represent you on your behalf. Britain said, yeah, you might not get to vote for the British Parliament, but we're doing what's best for all of England, even though you don't have a say in it. Okay, so kind of like today, you have a school board that virtually represents you. They're doing what's in the best interest of the community of Mundelein. You didn't vote for them, but they are ruling on your behalf. All right. Whereas when you pick your homecoming queen, for example, you have actual representation. You are picking who you want to be the homecoming queen. You have a say. So we disagreed about the meaning of virtual versus actual representation. All right. And the colonists said that Parliament can regulate trade. They've done that with the Navigation Acts, but you cannot tax us unless we're going to have representation. Okay? So one of the more notable speeches in opposition to this was by a guy named Patrick Henry. All right, you might be familiar with him from a very famous speech he will get not given until 1775. This is 1765. All right, his Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech that our textbook is named for doesn't happen for another 10 years. But he was giving a speech here in 1765 in response to the Stamp Act, and he said, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I had his Cromwell, and George III, and then somebody yells out in the crowd, treason, because he's essentially advocating killing the king. And then he pauses and says, may profit by their example. And then he says, if this be treason, make the most of it. Probably his second most famous speech, but this and his oratorical skills really inspire people to oppose the Stamp Act. All right? Actions they took included forming a group called the Sons of Liberty. Not like the people you saw in the History Channel miniseries last year, but this was a group of merchants and businessmen and people throughout the colonies that were going to use force to try to protest the Stamp Act. So they would threaten tax collectors or people that paid the tax. They would tar and feather you. All right. They would force people to resign. And then most importantly, they organized a boycott of British goods. So they would not buy these things, these almanacs and these dice and these playing cards, in the hopes that it would hurt the merchants that are selling these, all right, who had a lot of political power and a lot of political clout in England. All right. And for those of you who don't know what tar and feathering is, here's a famous portrayal of one. It's a cartoon. Notice they call it the Liberty Tree. There's a noose hanging here. You see some tea getting dumped in the harbor. This is kind of symbolic of the Boston Tea Party, which is coming later. But they would take hot tar and cover your body in it and then throw feathers on top of you just to humiliate you. But it would actually be a pretty gruesome experience, because if you ever had hot tar on your skin, the only way to get it off is to peel it. And there's a great scene from the movie John Adams. You can YouTube it. I do not want to show it to you. But if you YouTube John Adams' tar and feather scene, it's pretty gruesome when you look at it. But make sure you get Mom and Dad's permission before you see it. All right. Another famous incident was a mob of Sons of Liberty destroyed Governor Thomas Hutchinson's house. He was the royal governor, a Massachusetts citizen in Boston that was appointed to be in charge of England, and he decided to enforce the Stamp Act. And when he did, the Sons of Liberty destroyed his home, broke the china, broke the windows, and no repercussions because of it. And you may not know Thomas Hutchinson, even though he's an important figure, because he's the governor of Massachusetts who supports the king. But I'm sure you know his grandmother. All right, we'll see who that is. All right, and then finally, all right, the Stamp Act was repealed here in 1766 due to pressure from British merchants. They were losing money, and they did have a vote. So they pressured Parliament to get rid of this, and Britain's response is what we'll talk about in class tomorrow. Okay, so I would say the word of the day is boycott. All right, because that's how the Sons of Liberty were able to get this law repealed and change behavior here momentarily of the British government. We're going to see that pop up again several times throughout history. So 5 points to the first person that gets one on the word wall. And remember, second period, you got to be the early bird to get the worm. All right. But as the colonists started saying here, a change would do you good. So thanks for listening. And remember, here at the Kuhn Academy, we're not just learning history, we're making history.